Channel 30, Iola, Fort Scott, Chanute.
KTWU presents A Conversation with Sam Brownback. Senator Brownback grew up on a farm near Parker, Kansas. He received his Bachelor of Science degree from Kansas State University and his law degree from the University of Kansas. He served as State Secretary of Agriculture and U.S. Representative from the 2nd District before being elected to the Senate in 1996. He was re-elected in 1998 and will be up for re-election next year. Dr. Bob Beatty is an assistant professor of political science at Washburn University in Topeka. He teaches classes on American government, presidential elections, and international politics. He is the author of the new book, Democracy, Asian Values, and Hong Kong.
Senator Brownback, thanks for taking the time to come on the program.
Happy to join you, Bob.
We have a number of things we can talk about, and I'd like to start with a general question, sort of a political science-y type question. You've been in the House and the Senate. The Senate was set up by the Founding Fathers, some say to check the impulses of the House. Originally it was, the senators were appointed by state legislatures. What do you see as the differences between the House and the Senate? And is it still a check on the House?
The quote that Senator Byrd is used to using often, and he's kind of the guru of the nature of the Senate. Philosophically, I disagree with him on a number of issues, but on the history of the Senate, he is a guru, and he's written books on this topic and speaks on it about the Senate being the saucer that cools the passions coming over from the House. And we are a cooling body. I tell you, it seems like we really do slow down a lot of things. Yet when we need to move, really need to move, we can. After 9/11, that week afterwards, we authorized action into Afghanistan and appropriated $40 billion for war effort there, and $20 billion for that and $20 billion for the reconstruction in New York. So we can move rapidly, but I find the biggest differences between the two bodies that in the Senate it is very much an individual operation. I mean, you go and you work on issues, and you can stop the whole body, and you can propose an amendment on most bills, and you can do this. It's track meet. The House is very much a team sport. You've got to work with a group of people if you've got any hopes of getting anything to move. So it's a lot more a rugby match, and I use that analogy other than others because there does develop a scrum to move things on forward, and the Senate much more of an individual chess game, an individual operation. But you can sure get things done in the Senate a lot easier than you can in the House.
Isn't it a bit ironic that the Senate can be a check on the House or even the passions of the public, and so one senator can hold up legislation, for example.
Whole thing.
And so some people say, well, that's anti-democratic, one person holding up, the will of the majority. And, the Founding Fathers would say this is protecting democracy. And haven't we been seeing a lot of that with judgeships being held up and filibustered? And I've even seen some senators say, let's get rid of the filibuster. Let's get rid of the cloture rule, which requires 60 senators, to pass something. What's your feelings on this?
Well, on that one, the issue of judges, the Constitution provides the Senate with the authority to advise and consent. And as you know, there have been a lot of questions about what does advise and consent mean? Does it even require the Senate to vote? And over time, we've determined that yes, it does require the Senate to vote, and that's the way we're going to operate. But we've never had a filibuster. It's always been by a majority vote. Then you either advise and consent and agree or disagree. Had a Supreme Court judge, Fortas, that was filibustered, and outside of that, you haven't had a circuit court, a lower court judge filibustered. But now we're getting into filibustering of circuit court judges taking place, and that's what people are trying to do away with the filibuster rule on. Is saying that this will lower the threshold to 51 votes. That does comply with the Constitution on advise and consent on judges. You don't do away with the filibuster on any other issue other than on judges and appointments. And we're doing that because the operation now has changed. We didn't used to get filibusters on judicial nominations because everybody kind of agreed that the system would be you wouldn't filibuster judges. That's changed. The courts are becoming the front and center issue in American politics because they've integrated themselves so much on the toughest issues facing the society that my estimation really should come through the legislative process rather than being determined by the courts. And so I think you're going to see the courts increase in people's interest, focus, ire, and you're going to see a lot more focus in the legislative bodies attempting to gain back some of the authority that a number of people feel like we have allowed to accrete to the courts.
Well, let's talk a bit about the courts. I've heard you mention that you believe judges should be constructionists. Is this correct?
Yes.
Rather than those who abide by what is called the living Constitution?
Yes.
Could you describe why you believe that?
Well, I think a judge should be a judge and not a legislator, is why I believe that. I've met and had that discussion with members of the Supreme Court that if you'll stay to your job of being a judge, and that is to stay within the confines of the Constitution and its allowance of authority, we're the ones that should be legislators and pass, and then you should determine whether or not this was constitutional or not, but not discovering new laws or writing new portions in them. Because if you become a legislator, then the legislative bodies, before they appoint a judge, are going to want to know what's your political philosophy, and we're appointing you for life. I do not think that's a healthy way for us to go, and particularly when you're talking about some of the toughest of social issues. Let's take one right now for the Supreme Court, whether or not you can say the Pledge of Allegiance as a child in school, because it says one nation under God. Ninth Circuit says no, that this violation of church-state separation. This is, you got 90% of the public is saying, I think this flag salute's pretty good, and that you shouldn't be pulling that out. The court keeps moving that way, and they've been on about a 40-year string of removal of God from the public square, which started in '62 with prayer in the classroom and has moved on through, and now you're at this point. You're going to continue to have real difficulty.
Isn't that exactly the problem? The Constitution was written passed in 1789. It is incredibly vague on so many different things, including separation of church and state. And often legislators won't tread there. For example, under your criteria, was Brown versus Board a bad decision then? Because they sort of, many people say that the Supreme Court found a way to get rid of, segregation in public school.
But was that the right determination at the outset, that you could do separate but equal? And if all people are created equal, can you treat them separately? I mean, I would argue that the precursor to Brown was inappropriately decided, under the very basis of what the Constitution is, of we treat all people equally. And the court's not always gotten everything right.
Oh, I know.
You can
we know.
look at Dred Scott.
That's right.
A dreadful decision, if you want to use that term. The courts have gotten things wrong in the past. And I think you've got, and the more activist-oriented the court is going to be, the more likely it's going to step into some of that train. And then you've just got, take for instance the recent soft money decision.
Yeah, we'll get to that. 5-4 decision, one vote swings the whole, and we're getting, many of these decisions are very closely divided. That's for sure.
So I really think the courts should re-examine where they've been treading, and I think you're going to see the legislative bodies start to press more to regain the authority that they think they should have as a legislator.
Yeah, and I see your point.
And that's a constant thing within the checks and balances systems of the three branches of government. There's always kind of the executive is pushing to get their authority, the Congress pushes back. The judicial, I think, has asserted and grown a lot in authority in the last 30 to 40 years. And I think you're going to see the legislative start to push back on that.
I think it may be also more a conflict between federalism and a nation, as a nation. Because under federalism, when states can do certain things, again, they're not always correct, such as slavery, things of that nature. And then who steps in? And if the Congress won't step in, often the courts may step in and say this is simply unacceptable for these 12 states to have this. Some cases that's good, as you pointed out. Other cases that's bad. I think it's sort of an ongoing conflict in regarding federalism and what's the general welfare of the nation.
A legitimate argument. I think you're on, and this will be a major political issue for a period of time now. And now we've started engaging on judges that, and Senator Schumer out of New York really pushed this openly at first, and I was aghast when he did. It says we should examine political philosophy of judges. And prior it was always said, no, you leave that on a judge is to be a judge, and you should vote on this person based upon judicial temperament, qualifications, abilities, but not political philosophy because they're not legislators. And yet now that is exactly what we're on. Remember, Reagan was pushed back all the time and said, you got a litmus test on the life issue. Said, no, we don't have that. Now you've got a litmus test on the life issue from the other side. And people readily agreeing that, well, that's fine to have that litmus test. We're really treading, I think, in the bad terrain, and we should get back to more judges being judges is the right answer, because otherwise you're going to force groups, legislators are going to start saying, well, okay, we're going to pass laws that we say are not reviewable by the courts. So Article 3, Section 2 powers to remove appellate court jurisdiction, or you're going to get people pushing to try to impeach judges on issues other than moral turpitude or criminal activity by a judge, or to limit the terms of judges, which maybe is the route one should go, just saying, okay, a judge is appointed for a 15-year term period. That's it.
Well, certainly there's more accountability when the legislature takes on a lot of these issues. You mentioned campaign finance, and of course the Supreme Court just ruled on that. And let me briefly mention the campaign finance bill, which said, upheld by the Supreme Court, prohibits national parties or candidates from accepting or soliciting soft money, including donations from corporations and unions, restricts election time political ads by special interest groups, and bans political ads mentioning federal candidates in their districts a month before a primary election and 2 months before Election Day. So let me ask you, did you support the bill that was passed?
I did not.
And why not?
I thought it was unconstitutional, the way the 4 judges that ruled against the bill held. The political speech, which is people contribute funds to private groups, to the NAACP, to National Rifle Association, to the Sierra Club, to voice an opinion. And political speech is the highest level of protected speech. It looks like now we may end up protecting pornography at a higher level than political speech. And the time when people are most focused on their determination of what they're going to do, on who they're going to elect, is a month or 2 months before the election. And I don't like it when groups come in and advertise against me in an election. And I've had that happen in spades. I don't like it, but it is their right to be able to advertise and to be able to convey a message and to say, we disagree with Sam Brownback on this point, and here is why. And the time when people are really focusing on that is 30 to 60 days ahead of the election. So now you're removing that ability from a number of private groups to be able to speak. Now, I want to say something on the other side of it, and I see the majority opinion of this, and there is some accuracy to it, that the influence of money in the system does take place when you have this much money flowing into the system. The problem with that is that you have so much authority in the federal government and impacting so many people, it attracts that. And if you limit it this way, it finds another way into the system because it's just not going to be denied. So I think the best thing you can basically do is get rapid reporting and accountability so people can see who's putting the money in to do these things and let them make their decisions.
One problem with advertising at the end of an election, near the voting, of course, is that one day before, an ad could come out and say Senator Brownback is X, it's false, it's not true, it may sway the election, and a day after they may say, we'll happily pay the FEC fine, we just won an election. I mean, there's really almost no check on this. How do you control that? Let's say that you can advertise as much as you want a week before the election, but it's false. There's been really no check on that except for fines, which people are happy to pay if it means they win. They can help defeat somebody. What do we do about that?
What have we been able to do to date? And we've tried to impact that. If people are willing to say and do scurrilous things right ahead of elections, they've done that. I do place my faith in the electorate to be able to discern and to say, is this accurate or inaccurate? And you can look at Kansas history on some of this. Take election between Bennett and Carlin for governor. It was said that just ahead of the election that John Carlin sent out a series of flyers saying that your electric rates have gone up and it's Bob Bennett that did it, and that tilted the election. It probably had some impact, but did that really determine that election cycle? It's like saying that in a basketball game, the guy that made the last shot won the game. He did make the last shot, but what about the other 39 minutes up until that point in time? I mean, I think there's just a lot of more factors that are involved, and that you should allow free speech to work and work aggressively.
What about money and politics? I mean, myself and my students, we can't comprehend the amount of, New York Senate race, $60, $70 million. And of course, New York's a big state with a big media market, so we can sort of understand it. But, President Clinton was criticized for selling the Lincoln bedroom, for example. But President Bush has been doing literally hundreds of fundraisers. And he's done, I think, and again, I may not know the exact number, 7 to 10 press conferences and over, 150 fundraisers. Is there an imbalance there? I mean, how about 150 press conferences and 7 fundraisers? Because the fundraisers, he's talking to people that are going to donate money. So these are friends. He's talking, preaching to the choir type things. So is that really helping the general public for President Bush to be spending a fair amount of time, and President Clinton too, and Al Gore did it as vice president, seeking money and giving speeches and posing for photographs? Or what's the role of all this in the American body politic?
See, and that's why I get back, because I've looked at this issue for a long time, and I've wrestled with it, and I don't like fundraising.
Yeah.
I don't know. Fun, but I don't know of many people running for public office that do.
Yeah.
It's probably the thing that they enjoy the least. The thing I enjoy the most are interactions like this, town hall meetings. I just did talk radio. You're talking issues. You're engaging the public in it. I mean, you're talking big ideas. That's what people enjoy. But what are your options then? Say, okay, we don't like this system because money does influence the system, and I think it does have influence on the system. But I think your answer is to report it, whereas people would say, well, really your other option is one of two. Either make everybody self-finance, which means you could only have people that are wealthy enough to self-finance to run for office, or public financing.
Right.
We've tried public financing in the presidential races, and we had election problems even with those who did comply with the limits and accepted public financing, and we still had difficulties. President Clinton complied with the limits, used the public financing, and we had the whole series of problems still even associated with that. Plus, there's a lot of people you look at and say, you're going to have the government finance candidates coming into office. Is that the way we want to use taxpayer resources?
Well, most of my students have no idea that we pay for the general election campaigns, which I get a kick out of, or that the taxpayers pay for the matching funds in the primaries, and they sort of look at me. But
I think you look at your set of options on this, and you say, really the thing you should do is have reasonable limits on it, which I think you should, and that's what we've done on individual contributions, and rapid reporting. 48 hours, posted on the internet, here's who contributed to these campaigns, here's who's putting this money into these campaigns, is to me the really what you ought to go at, is the most likely system to work and let the electorate know what's taking place.
Okay, well, yes, that's also, I think, going to be an ongoing.
It will be an ongoing, because you're not going to see McCain-Feingold in the influence of money in campaigns.
No, so what we're watching is, now that the Supreme Court has ruled, where is it going to
And it will take place.
appear?
Unfortunately, that as long as you have that much power concentrated in Washington, you're going to see money try to figure out some way to influence it.
Moving on to Medicare.
Hmm.
First of all, just ask, did you vote for the Medicare bill?
Yes, I did.
And why? Why did you think it was a bill that in the end was worth voting for?
One, on a very practical Kansas issue, this was the biggest upgrade and support for rural health care that has come out of Medicare probably since the inception of the program. Excuse me, Kansas is a heavily Medicare-dependent state, particularly in our rural counties. I visit with counties often, with rural health care providers all the time. They're heavily Medicare-dependent hospitals. They are not paying their way. Medicare is not paying its way for that hospital. Chuck Grassley was one of the lead negotiators on the bill. He chairs the Finance Committee from the Senate side. He's from Iowa. His focus was rural health care, and he got a lot of resources in to really try to make that gap up. And so this is really going to be beneficial to our rural hospitals and rural providers. That's, many people's thinking, a sidebar, but if you're a senator representing Kansas, that is not a sidebar issue. This is real life and death. The second issue of it is we're going to have to deal with the prescription drug issue. The political impetus had built, you would not design and create Medicare today without a prescription drug benefit, because so many people's health care is dependent upon that. Whereas when we first started Medicare, it wasn't that high of a percentage. So you're going to have to get that into the system. But on top of that, we've got to modernize Medicare if we have any hope of the baby boomers being able to use Medicare to the degree that the current generation does. Because the demographics are just way off. When the baby boomers retire, you got 72 million in that cohort. You don't have enough people coming up paying for the system. This is a pay-as-you-go system. And I thought it had a reasonable chance, with the modernization features put in this, of being able to make and extend the life expectancy of the Medicare system. It is a bit of a gamble, because when you make changes in a major welfare social program that is an entitlement, you're not exactly sure how it's going to fit, because you have smart people out here receiving it, and they're going to figure different ways around the system. But it seemed to me to be a legitimate chance that you could make this work.
Reading from an article after it was passed, it says the new law prohibits Medicare from using its purchasing power to negotiate with drug makers. Pharmaceutical companies adamantly opposed to price controls prefer to deal with dozens of private buyers rather than a single federal agency. Senator John McCain, who's often in the news, described the ban on direct negotiations as, quote, outrageous. Why can't Medicare negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies to get those prices down?
Well, the Medicare director, Thomas Scully, says that they do. We do negotiate in some of our larger purchasing groups, like the veterans that purchases does negotiate. And I want to say in this parenthetical, but it does apply here, I voted for the importation of drugs from Canada and to allow that to take place, because you've got a very simple thing taking place here. Drug companies are investing hundreds of millions of dollars to invent new pharmaceutical products. They're coming out with some beautiful products that are really making life better, longer for a lot of people. I mean, I have a lady here in Topeka. She gets a weekly shot for arthritis. The shot costs $1,100. But with it, she can move her hands, the pain's gone.
Right.
Medicaid is paying for that $1,100 shot a week. Beautiful product. What you see taking place, the drug companies are investing all this money. They're saying we will recoup our money from the U.S. marketplace, and then they are negotiating and forced to negotiate with Canada and the Europeans and Mexico, who say we're going to have a price control system here, and if you're going to sell in our marketplace, it will be at this price. And they're willing to take that because they're getting their return off of the U.S. marketplace, and their development cost is huge, but their unit cost after they've developed the product to make another pill is pennies. So I think they ought to be working closer with the United States and saying, we're not going to make you pay for the full price of the development of this drug. And price controls have not worked in this country. So I don't think they're really the answer.
Is the difference because it is drugs? I mean, because, you know, any company, you know, could argue we spent a lot of money on research development, but darn it, Walmart just negotiated us down to just making this percentage of profit. So is it because they're drug companies that applies? Because it can apply. That's capitalism. You know, you have to invest money and hopefully then reap the benefit. Is it because they're drugs that this is sort of a special case?
Well, I think there is some of that, because Walmart negotiates with these drug companies too, because they've got pharmacies, and they only get them down to a certain price. And you know, if Walmart could get them down lower and beat the competition on it, they would do it, because they're very effective about being able to do that. I think the issue is you've got an insatiable demand for a product that once you get once you develop it, you have a 7-year patent on that.
Well, and of course, what's not mentioned, and maybe the media just assumes we all know, is that Canada has socialized medicine, and we do not. And that's an important fundamental difference. And if we had socialized medicine, obviously, we'd be doing things the way Canada does, but we have a different system. So it's more of a philosophical question as well, isn't it?
Well, but I think it's a philosophical question on the issue of price controls.
Okay.
And we have tried price controls in this country. We've tried them on rent controls, and Nixon tried them on cattle. I remember growing up on the farm when he had price controls on beef, and boy, did we hate that system.
President Nixon also wanted well, he briefly flirted with a minimum wage for, the poor. He had Patrick Moynihan in there. But anyway.
But my point in saying it is, they've not worked in this country. And let's say you went to price controls, like what Canada did. So now the drug companies are working off of a price control system in the United States, too.
Well, then the government would have to subsidize, if it, probably in that case, which would be socialized medicine.
And would it work?
Well,
look at the things that we subsidize, and do they actually work? I mean, the marketplace is difficult, is unruly, is generally quite effective on developing new products. So that's why I think really what we should be doing at this point is putting pressure on the drug companies to lower their price in the U.S. and not make us carry the full cost of this.
Because the other countries
are skating on us.
We're subsidizing other countries.
Of the Canadian consumer, the European, which if it were just the third world developing countries that don't have the income level that we do, you could look past some of that.
Because Canada, Great Britain, and Australia are saying to the drug companies, this is what we'll pay.
Price controls.
And if you do not accept, we're not going to buy your product.
Nor can you sell any products into this marketplace.
And so they'll take a loss in these countries and then keep prices high in America because they've taken a loss in Australia and Canada. Is that correct? Have I summed that up?
That's because their per unit cost,
yes,
they can meet in Australia and Canada at these lower prices, because the price of making another pill is literally pennies. The price of development was very large, and they got to recoup it. They generally recoup it within that period of time that they have the patent.
Well, the estimate is 43 million people in the United States without health insurance. And tell me if I'm summing this up correctly as well. It seems like that our system, and I'm not advocating any system, but a system that currently doesn't work, because if you don't have health insurance, you're not going to go in and get something fixed. So you're going to wait till it festers, literally. Then you're going to run to the emergency room, and it's going to cost a fortune to fix you, because you maybe don't have enough money, so somebody else has to pay. So people with health insurance pay for that person without health insurance because their bill is so expensive, so our health insurance goes up. Have I summed that up, that that's a problem?
Well, it's a problem. I don't know that I would agree with that this is the set of factors and the way it moves.
Okay.
It's an enormous problem. It has been an enormous problem for us for some period of time. And we basically have created or allowed the evolution of a system to where you're cross-subsidizing from one area to another area. And so a hospital, Topeka Hospital, St. Francis, Stormont Vale, charges this person who can pay the full freight and this insurance company or Medicare and Medicaid as much as they can, because they've got to pay for this person who can pay nothing. And you've got this kind of uneasy, difficult cross-subsidization. And generally when you get involved in any situation like that, it's an inefficient type of system because then hospitals, and we're seeing it taking place now, they make a certain amount of money, actually make some profit on surgeries. But a number of people are saying, well, you know what, I could do those surgeries separately, a separate surgery center. I will make more profit and I can pocket that. And the hospital's saying, wait a minute, we use that to subsidize our people without health care insurance. And so you're constantly coming up with issues.
Is it a crisis yet? I mean, in state legislatures, when something like this happens, the governor will call a special session. I mean, at what point does the U.S. Congress say this is, when it gets to 50 million, 60 million, at what point do we say, goodness, what are we going to do about this?
Well, again, Bob, I go, what are your options here?
Well, you know, socialized health care. I think that's the option.
That is an option.
Or what we have now, or that's what I'm saying, is there minds that can get together and come up with something in between.
And what we've tried is to come up with that something in between, because most people in this country don't want to go to a socialized health care system. We recruit regularly physicians into this country from Canada, into this state from Canada. Why do they come here? They don't like the socialized health care system. You hear stories all the time of difficulty, people waiting huge periods of time to get into the socialized medicine system, or coming to the United States to get health care because they can get it on a timely basis. Is government going to run this more efficiently than we are out of the private sector? So what we've tried to do is to try to find the middle way. Cassabaum Kennedy was an effort of doing that. You may remember Nancy Cassabaum's bill where she was trying to extend the length of time that the insurance company had to carry you after you left a job, and do a number of things that said you couldn't push a person out of health care for this or that reason. We've tried to separate and provide more health care benefits under Medicaid, provide more money to the states under Medicaid to catch the real the population that does not have income to be able to handle these issues. We're now providing prescription drug benefit to 23% of the population that's elderly that did not have a prescription drug benefit.
So sort of attacking it.
Various
different
prongs. Trying to do medical malpractice reform to try to reduce the cost in the system.
Although I would guess.
So and that's how we've been going at this, is piece, because your other option, which is to say, all right, let's just give up and go to socialized medicine. You look at those socialized systems and tell me that they are working better than here.
I'm not an expert, but you know, for example, Germany. You know, we use Canada and Great Britain, justly so, as bad examples. But I've never heard a German complaint. So I mean, maybe there's some systems out there that do work. I guess what I'm saying is that I think as these numbers may increase on people without health care, politically it's going to hit some level down the road, maybe 5, 8, 10 years. But so that's just something for people to look out for.
Well, and I would say as a concluding comment here too, health care issues are going to continue to be top-level issues for us because of the cost and the great ability. We are discovering things and ways to care for people that are miraculous.
And people are living longer.
And are beautiful and expensive.
Before we get into foreign policy, although I'm enjoying the discussion very much.
Me too.
Abortion. Tell me what did Congress passed regarding abortion, so we can start off with that.
we passed the partial birth abortion ban. And, excuse me, what that did was take a particular procedure, particularly gruesome procedure, where a child is partially born, the body is born, the head is left inside the womb, and then the skull has to be crushed to deliver the child on forward. 75% of the public is opposed to this procedure. They believe this child in that position is a child, and they disagreed with this procedure being done. It has passed the Congress multiple times, been vetoed by the President Clinton twice, and it was passed and signed into law by President Bush, and now being challenged in the courts.
Was a criticism of this that it did not take into account the health of the mother in disallowing this procedure?
There was that criticism
and in fact,
of it.
It's banned despite the health of the mother. Is that correct?
A life of the mother exception
Okay.
There's a life of the mother exception on this when you have a competing life here.
So it's life versus health.
Yeah, and a number of people look at the health exception saying, okay, what? Is that a mental health issue?
So there's
Is it
a
an
life
emotional?
exception.
There is a
Okay.
life exception to it.
Which is not always clear. I read health, and I did.
No,
don't
there
see that
is a life exception to it.
Is your goal to see abortion illegal?
My goal here is to really talk to the hearts and minds of the American public and to say to them and ask the very basic question and have it answered, because I ask this question often and it doesn't get answered. Is the child in the womb a person or is it a piece of property? It is one of the two under our jurisprudence system. It is one of the two.
In some cases, in some different laws, it falls under different categories, as you well know. For example, manslaughter laws and things of that nature.
Currently, but I'm asking as a moral being that you are, what is the child in the womb? Not by legal definitions or legal fictions, which we create all the time. What is it? It's one or the other.
So,
I mean,
if it's a human being, then abortion has to be illegal.
If it is a human being that is entitled to rights, and we're responsible to this child, just as we clearly agree once this child is born, it is a person, and that person has rights. And we find it, abhorrent to deny a baby that has been born rights. It's repugnant to us. What is the child 1 minute before that that's still in the womb? We need to make this determination as a society and to determine what this is, and that's really what this debate is about. What is the child? Because I'm convinced, again, of the goodness of the American public, that once they look at this and they say, okay, if I have to make that determination, clearly in the case of partial birth abortion, this is a child, and I don't want to kill children. And if there's a competing life, the mother's life, now we have a very difficult choice we have to make. And I say you give a life exception, obviously, to the mother, to preserve the life of the mother.
If the Supreme Court will not overturn Roe versus Wade, do you have any sort of strategy to sort of at least chip away at abortion rights?
The President, I think, has framed it right, where you have to work, and it's an issue of changing hearts and minds to the public. This is Lincoln's philosophy. He says, America moves by establishing a common thought. I'm asking this basic question, we've had this debate before in our country, as you well know as a political science professor. What was the slave in America? Was the slave a person or a piece of property?
Of course, that led to war. I mean, this is
and I hope and pray that
contentious issue.
It was for a long period of time. But do you remember how we went through that? And then for a period of time we said, well, the slave is 3/5 of a person. Remember, that was in the Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
And you're going, well, that doesn't quite make sense.
So this is an
to me.
ongoing, long-term, continuous debate.
I think it's going to be for some period of time. And it's probably for us the toughest social issue of our era. But it
There's no question about that.
means so much throughout the society because it is about how do you view the other person that's across from you. Is that person sacred and beautiful and a unique entity?
The problem
the
problem is getting a discussion about abortion without one from each side literally yelling at each other or having a discussion. Can be difficult in American politics.
Can be very,
As
and
you
has
well
been in the
know.
past.
Let's switch over to foreign policy. I wanted to ask you about Fort Riley, and you've been in some discussions with people about some possibilities with Fort Riley. Would you like to explain that?
I'm excited about what's taking place in the transformation of the Army. We've already seen this take place in the Air Force, where we've taken our assets and positioned them back on the continental United States, not even continental, but on the United States soil, and then project force out from here. We did bombing runs in Afghanistan from Knob Noster, Missouri, refueling twice in air and over and back. When you're protecting a resource that's lives and worth $800 million a plane, you want to put them someplace safe. They're doing and starting the transformation of the Army to do the same thing, to reposition forces in the United States and then project out of here. And I want Fort Riley to be one of those major projection bases, and I think we've got a good shot of seeing that happen. Relocation of the Big Red One or another division headquarters, more troops coming back, allowing them to buy homes in the area, build up assets, have a spouse go to school, get a job, and then whatever the time period is, project out the force.
That'd mean a lot for Kansas, that's for sure.
And to the soldier, to not be stationed overseas for a long period of time when we have the capacity to be able to do this today. And then station interim bases that are where the equipment is laid in, but it's just minimally staffed in Uzbekistan or other places closer to where our action is today. Why do we have large levels of troops in Germany or Italy today?
Well, that's correct, and a lot of soldiers are also moving to Eastern Europe. I was in Albania and saw some American soldiers there, and we have a NATO base there, even though they're not a member of NATO. But that leads me to, we'll talk about Iraq. Did you vote on the whole Iraq issue and the use of force based on the weapons of mass destruction issue, or was it larger? Was it larger than that?
It was larger than that. And I want to say too, Bob, I was receiving the same intelligence reports under the Bush administration as I was under the Clinton administration.
Mm-hmm.
And the intelligence community was consistently saying Iraq has chemical and biological weapons and is working on nuclear, but we don't know how far developed. That was their consistent position. They had stated that Iraq had used chemical weapons against their own population in the south, the Kurds, and then against the Iranians in the Iraqi-Iranian war, had used them. But there was a bigger issue that was involved here as well, and that is that if you're going to go with this issue of terrorism, and one of the key points of it is to drain the swamp, you've got to press for open societies, democracies, tolerance, human rights, gender rights, religious freedoms in a portion of the world that we have not stood for our basic values for some period of time, and that's the Middle East. We have said, yes, we believe in justice and freedom and human rights, and that's great and everywhere in the world, but it comes to Saudi Arabia, well, let's think about this a little bit.
I'll get back to Iraq, but you mentioned Saudi Arabia. You're right. Their system is in many ways inimical to what we stand for in the United States, and yet they have oil. So what do we do? How do we deal with Saudi Arabia? Because the cynic would say, well, as long as we get our oil, I guess we'll just let them do whatever we want. But is that how we deal with them?
If we do, we will have long-term problems, and that's what we have today. Because we basically have given the Saudis a pass for years on this, even though they had no human rights, no gender equality, no religious freedom.
Terrible
corruption, and you've got a ruling elite and a number of others.
And reports are funding anti-American mosques abroad from the Saudis.
A huge number. As I was traveling in Central Asia in the late 90s, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, I constantly ran across government leaders in that area saying, we are fighting two countries here in the war on terrorism, fighting the Saudis and the Iranians. And they were funding a mosque, a community center that would start out, fine, but out of it would spin a terrorist group. And we were confronting them at that time, but we wouldn't say the words then. And now, finally, it's starting to come out in the open, and we just have to press aside. And we have to stand. We're best when we stand on principle. When we stand on our principles, we're good. When we move off of it for near-term reasons, like we did in Central America on confronting communism in the 70s, we confronted communism, said, as long as you're against the communists, we'll be with you, and we backed a number of dictators and tin-horn generals, and the people did not like us for it because we walked away from our principles. We've done a repeat of that in the Middle East.
Well, I'm flying all around here, but you're giving me lots of threads to ask about. Based on principles, let's look at China and Taiwan. I've heard you talk earlier about this. Taiwan, of course, is a democracy now. They've had a long struggle for the last 30 some odd years. China is not. China is, of course, we both know, developing, certainly, in many say positive directions, but the fact is they're a dictatorship, one party. Taiwan is a multi-party democracy. And yet, we have the one China policy where we side with China. How do we get around that as far as principles are concerned?
I think you have to stand by your principles. It's democracy, open society, human rights, which is what Taiwan is seeking to do. I understand what the president is doing.
Mm-hmm.
I've not talked to him about this, but they are very
well,
sequential.
China has nuclear weapons.
But it's not just that. It's North Korea, in my estimation.
Okay.
Because North Korea is a failed state and is showing all the systems failures that we saw coming out of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe when they were communist. They have, we think there's somewhere around 150,000 North Koreans that have walked into China just to flee the oppression and hunger. Hearing reports of anarchy in North Korea.
So I'm sorry, so you're saying that our policy with China is linked to our policy with North Korea?
At this point in time, the Bush administration has been very sequential in their fighting. When they were going at Afghanistan, they weren't talking about anybody else in the world. You're going at Iraq, we're not talking about anybody else. What you're seeing take place is North Korea is basically the arms supplier to the bad guys in the world. I mean, other people
they found
do
that sort of ship full of arms.
But they do it
from
everywhere.
North Korea.
The people who won't sell to the Iranians, or they won't sell to the Pakistanis at one point in time or others, they get their supplies from the North Koreans.
What sort of policy should we have in North Korea? Get the Chinese, the Japanese, and everybody sort of to gang up on them so it's not just the United States?
That's the present push. And to stop their illicit economy. Their legal economy, fine. But they are funding much of their country today off of drug running, gun running, trafficking in persons to a smaller degree, but yet a degree as well, counterfeiting our money. And if we could get just the nations in the region to say, we're going to stop the illegal North Korean economy, the country may well collapse. Plus, you've got to get a human rights portfolio in the negotiations going. The North Korean people have human rights. And that's something that we have to push.
Not according to the North Korean government.
No, that's true.
It is one of the strangest, well, you know, states in the world right now, North Korea.
And it is collapsing. And that's a dangerous phase for it to be in.
Well, and it's difficult because if they completely collapse, South Korea has said, goodness, what are we going to do? They'd like to see it sort of a Eastern European type, hopefully gradual change, but it's such a difficult situation.
And that's just not the nature of totalitarian collapses.
That's right.
I mean, as we've seen in the world, they just don't evolve, they collapse.
Although they're so brainwashed, one doesn't really know what would happen, I think.
That's
the people in general.
That's a big part of it. But the reports, and I meet with some North Korean refugees and groups, is that the people are starting to get the gig, that it's not the hermit kingdom it was, because so many people have had to forage for food in China, and the relative freedoms of China that they go into, they come back and say, it's not like Kim Jong-il's told us it was. Or even they were showing pictures on North Korean television of protests in South Korea against the trying to push the North Korean government, and that's why the North Korean government showed it. But the people reacted saying, well, that's a new building, that car. I thought they were all poor in South Korea and they didn't have anything, and we were much better. How did they get those cars? In the background of the protesters. So, you know, some of the, in this age where information is so much more ubiquitous than it was 20 years ago, it's tough to keep a hermit kingdom in the hermitage.
Well, along my thread here, as far as my reading of U.S. government policy, I can go to North Korea. They won't let me in, but I could go. However, most Americans cannot go to Cuba. What's your opinion on the fairly stringent sanctions we have on Cuba, and how about the idea that let's relax everything and let's flood them with information and radio and Floridians flocking over there and see how long they last, which I've heard is maybe an alternate to our current policy. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I'm conflicted on Cuba.
Yeah.
I voted to remove the travel ban. We just had that vote in the Senate. I had real hesitancy about it because Castro is a dictator.
Oh, yeah.
He's a thug. He has recently jailed a number of journalists, has recently committed a number of human rights atrocities. It's not as if he's kind of easing up or easing into retirement.
He's a communist dictator. There's no getting around that.
He is. But we've had this 40-plus-year policy, 40-year policy, that you could argue really hasn't worked. And I look at it, generally the better way for us to go is to engage rather than to...
Like China?
Like what we've done with China. Now, there are times when we should clearly just throw the book at a country. I think Syria right now is an example where they're allowing foreign mercenaries in against our troops in Iraq. We should really be trying to isolate Syria for what they're doing to us in Iraq. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that the policy we've engaged towards Cuba has not worked, and we've tried it diligently for a number of years, and that we should be moving away from some of that.
My students ask, why Cuba? And I say, well, look at domestic politics. Is really both parties? Okay. Is it Florida and that voting contingent in Florida that really just keeps the Cuba policy from ever changing?
That is a big part of it, but I want to respect that too, because the people that are advocating the position of you have to isolate and go at Cuba are Cuban Americans who fled, whose lives have been put on the line by this guy, who hold that very close to their memories, or property was taken away from them, and you got to look at it and say, you know what, they have a legitimate point of view.
They do, and it's also American politics. If you can get a contingent of voters together, your goal is to sway policy. And I tell my students that, hey, the lowest voting group in the U.S. is young people. You get together and start voting, you may have influence on more influence on fairly major policy decisions.
They do have an impact, the Cuban Americans, but I also want people to look at the basis of what they're doing it under, and they've got a legitimate basis for what they're asserting. I just question whether or not philosophically it's worked.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think possibly the opposite policy might produce more change in Cuba, since they're only 90 miles away.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to get back to Iraq. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, has been especially critical in the last week or so, and even more, saying that we did a masterful job with the action part of Iraq, but as Newt Gingrich says, we've blown the post-war Iraq, and he wants to change it. He says that when he looks at it, we look like an occupying country. Do you agree with Speaker Gingrich, or do you think we've been doing a better job than he's giving the Bush administration credit for?
I've been engaged on the issue of Iraq for some time. I was the chairman of that subcommittee up until this Congress, or the ranking member. I've held a number of hearings on Iraq. I've met with a number of Iraqi exiles. I've worked with the Iraqi National Congress over a period of years with Ahmed Chalabi, that's on the governing council. I thought we were absolutely masterful on the military offensive, and masterful as a country until the statue came down. And then past that, we didn't have a plan in place that was to the degree that it needed to be. I had advocated, as people had at the Defense Department, to engage the Iraqi National Congress, to work with them to be the initial transitional government that you put in immediately, not a U.S. figure. I mean, not a U.S. person as running the country.
Like in Afghanistan.
Like in Afghanistan, like Karzai.
Yeah.
Karzai
immediately became the face of Afghanistan.
And was Karzai democratically elected?
Not initially, but...
No, but there was some, unfortunately in Afghanistan you actually had a process, this Lloyd Jirga process.
In Germany they met, and then later they had the Jirga.
But that's what I was arguing. Then engage that process, create it for Iraq, and find a person or council or group that immediately after Saddam's out, you start this process, you work it together. Not everybody agrees, but this is the person, and it's an Iraqi. And that we go at it that way, and we didn't, because State Department and CIA opposed that route. They didn't like Dr. Chalabi. They didn't like the INC. They had questions about their background. And there are questions in their background. He's not Thomas Jefferson. But now we're at this point in time where we're deemed an
Playing catch-up.
occupying force,
Playing catch-up.
and this is the most dangerous time for us. It's not when we're on offense, it's when we're defending and patrolling. And we have to now, in my estimation, get an Iraqi governance stood up as rapidly as possible, and an Iraqi police and paramilitary force stood up as rapidly as possible, so that we can garrison our troops like we do in Afghanistan, not patrol, have the Iraqis patrolling, and then we move when the bad guys congregate.
Well, this time is going by actually very fast. I'll give you one last question. You know, this is the only soundbite of the hour. You're up for re-election, correct?
Yes, I am.
In the next cycle. There is some talk from the Kansas City Star that Joe Hoagland, who served as a Johnson County lawmaker, might challenge you. Any concern about that? Or you welcome the competition?
Now, I'm always concerned about any challenges in this in the political system. It has been a great honor for me to serve the people of Kansas. I love representing them, and I hope to be re-elected.
Well, hopefully we can do this again next term and the term after.
Look forward to it.
I want to thank Senator Sam Brownback for taking the time to talk about the issues of the day on this program, which will reach Kansans across the state via public television. I also want to thank KTWU and Topeka for producing this and other public affairs programs and their commitment to public participation in our democratic system. And keep your eyes open for further programs in the coming months with Kansas leaders and policymakers. But for now, it's time for us to go. Goodbye.
Did you miss part of this interview with Senator Brownback? Don't worry, it will be repeated tomorrow night at 10 on KTWU DT Digital Channel 23. Now stay tuned here on Channel 11 for BBC World News, followed by the Nightly Business Report and Charlie Rose. All coming up on KTWU.